hashgacha pratis, while it's hurting so terribly, you most probably feel like handing them their head. Hashgacha pratis is always something that in a lapse of pain we can afford. But in the midst of it, it's very, very difficult. However, this great tzaddik teaches us the following thing. If a person could only learn how to focus in an uninterrupted way on the concept of hashgacha pratis for every moment that he's living through his pain, so that he knows that every moment of pain is a testimony to the fact that Hashem is with him in that moment, and that the person is connected to the Hashem that is the source of his pain and suffering at that moment. The tzaddik said that a person that lives with that kind of a connection to Hashem in the moments of suffering and pain will have his pain and suffering alleviated. And let me try to analyze it and explain it a little bit. Let me try to develop the idea that he's proposing. What this tzaddik is proposing is as follows: that one of the greatest pains that a Jew goes through in pain and suffering, one of the greatest pains that he goes through is being alone, being disconnected, feeling isolated, feeling that nobody really cares or cares enough. And for a Yid, feeling so disconnected and not connected to the one that is bringing the pain at the time of the pain, leaves me only with the pain itself. And that for a Jew is unbearable. That's the chemistry of the Jewish soul. But if a Jew, while he's going through pain and suffering for every single moment, doesn't forget that every moment of pain is a stroke from Hashem. If I want the stroke, I don't want the stroke, but I know with a certainty that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with me, and the pain itself is the greatest testimony of Hashem's involvement with me. So then I have an ability to connect with Hashem and not merely with the pain. Let me give you an example of this in the flip side, on the positive side. That's much easier to understand. And then we'll take it to the more difficult side. Let's say you give a present to somebody. What do you ultimately want from the recipient? You want that the recipient should be totally involved in the gift itself and totally forget about the fact that there was a giver of the gift? I doubt it highly. I think you would be crestfallen and be broken if when you give the gift to the other person, he would say to you something like, okay, get out of here. I got what I wanted from you, and I'll enjoy myself. So we can see that there's a difference between focusing on the object that I've received or focusing on the one that gave the object and connecting with the one that gave the object. In similar fashion, the same model is true in terms of pain and suffering. The challenge in pain and suffering is not just to focus on what you've received, the pain and the suffering, but to be able to live with a consciousness that there is a giver that's very close that's giving that pain and suffering. And giving that pain and suffering for a reason that in our emunah we believe is for our ultimate good, though we very often can't. Gullus. According to some commentaries, what Gullus is isolating the physical world, making it a world that doesn't have to have Hashem in it. And maybe I bounce back and forth between the physical world and Hashem. I'm not always in the physical world, but the physical world is a separate world in which Hashem doesn't have to mix in. And then there's another, a religious arena, and I go in there occasionally for whatever reason, and I bounce back and forth. That's a description of Galus according to some commentaries, because creating space in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not present is Galus for a Jew. Creating any kind of space in which there's a vacuum and there's a void of Hashem's presence is by definition Galus. The Galus of Hashem from my life and my Galus from Hashem. And essentially, that's what we do when we live in a situation of pain and suffering. And we become so involved in the pain and suffering that we become totally disconnected from the one that's giving it with Hashgacha Pratis, that the pain and suffering can actually create the greatest pain, the greatest galus for us in the isolation and in the disconnection that we feel. It would be one thing if we didn't believe in Hashgacha Pratis. Then the arguments are different. But if we believe in Hashgacha Pratis, and we believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is connected to our lives, and He's connected to our lives in a way that's ultimately positive for us, so then why can't we hang on to that belief as we're going through the pain and suffering? For were we to be able to hang on to it, we would be able to have comfort in knowing that we're going through an experience with Hashem. This level of remaining connected is referred to in Kabbalistic literature as Bechinas Hadas, the ability of being able to be focused and connected in a concentrated way without interruption. Because after everything is said and done, let's face it, when do we fall? When do we make our mistakes? When do we get lost, if not in the moments that we're disconnected? The tzaddik continues, and he says that it could very well be that the reason why we experience so much pain is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts us through a situation where He takes away our ability to have this das, to have this connection. And in the absence of the connection, there's a guarantee of this pain. In a situation where a person is going through pain and suffering, let's develop it a little bit more. In a situation where a person is going through pain and suffering, and he becomes disconnected, he feels isolated, he feels alone. And in this time, Hashem is not operative in terms of the way he thinks emotionally and even intellectually in those moments of pain and suffering. What does he have to buy into? How does he have to function in those times? The only way that he can function in those times is to take up the natural orders of the world, the predictable causes and effects of the world, and try to manipulate them to his benefit, to alleviate his suffering. Because in the absence of Hashem and I'm all alone, what am I going to dip into? What am I going to hang on to? What will I call upon to help me if I'm disconnected from Hashem? The only thing that I can call to help me is to look in my world around me, the natural orders, and find some kind of a natural cause and effect that might help me. So I get hooked into Teva and Mikra. I get hooked into nature, the natural order, and living my life with the predictions of statistics and the predictions of natural orders. The reality is that this is a major distinction of Klal Yisrael over the nations of the world. Klal Yisrael has an ability if they connect to Hashem, even in the midst of their greatest pain and suffering, Klal Yisrael has a way of leaping the boundaries of all of the natural orders and believing in the causes and effects and connecting themselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and gaining strength from knowing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with them every moment. It's only the person that becomes disconnected and feels alone, that feels trapped, and therefore has to demote themselves to regulating their life and relegating their life to the orders of nature. But what Klal Yisrael is really all about is being able to connect to that which is lema'aleh min hateva, above the natural order, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. One of the ways that we do this, that we connect to what we're really connected to, is in the power of tefillah. That would be a good example. Because when a Jew stands in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's in crisis, and he's in pain and suffering, and he calls out to Hashem, if he's davening properly, without distraction, what is he really doing? What he's really doing is he's bringing Hashem back into his world. He wants to be able to live with an image of Hashem standing in front of him. He wants to be able to connect to Hashem. Tefillah calls out the person's ability to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with the suffering and with the pain. That's the power of tefillah. And that's why in next week's parsha, the pasuk says very eloquently, Mi Gai Gadol, is there a greater nation than Klal Yisrael? Asher lo elikim krayvim elav b'chol kareinu elav. Is there another people that has the greatness to them, that they have the ability to connect to Hashem through tefillah, that in the midst of their pain and suffering, they're not isolated from Hashem, but they're journeying through their experience with Hashem through the power of tefillah. With this, we understand on a homiletical level a very, very interesting piece of Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Brachos, towards the end of the Masechta, speaks about Rav Kirzner asking an interesting individual, which I can't get into what his history was. He asked him, Ma guha, how does an earthquake take place? What is an earthquake all about? This is what Rav Kirzner asked. And the individual answered Rav Kirzner, and I'll quote the Gemara and then try to explain it. Bishar HaKadosh Baruch Hu zeicher es banav. Earthquakes take place, he answered, when Hashem remembers his children. Shehem shruyim b'tzar bein ha'akum. That they are living in a Gentile world, wallowing in the pain. And what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? This is a very mystical Gemara. Meirid shtei dema'is liyam hagadol. HaKadosh Baruch Hu shed 2 tears into the great Yam, into the great ocean. V'kailai nishma misayf ha'olam ad sayfai. And then the voice of Hashem is heard from one end of the world to the other. Seemingly a mystical answer. What on earth is this supposed to mean? Hashem shedding tears into the Yam HaGadol, his voice being heard from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth. What is it supposed to mean? But based upon what we've just learned, what it means is as follows. When it says in the Gemara that HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembers his children that are wallowing in pain amongst the Gentile world, what it means is that they're wallowing in pain because they've adopted the philosophy of the world around them that would interpret all events by natural orders and predictable causes and effects. And when a Jew begins to define his whole life by the influences of the Gentile world around us, in which everything is interpreted and predicted